another thing that I wanted to talk about is the world, or should I say, like the West's reaction to Zelensky, or people were saying, let's arm Ukrainian civilians and let's fight for our right to self-determination. This has been praised by the rest of the world, but it hasn't been the case in other parts. For example, Palestinians have been fighting for their right to self-determination for over 70 years now, and we've heard crickets. Taiwan, other places, we might even get in trouble for having this conversation. So I wanted you to speak on that a little bit. Why the double standards? Why the hypocrisy? And, you know, I'm just going to put it out there for you to speak on it.
Yeah, I do think this is giving us some insight into some of the fundamental inequalities that are built into our world order. I think the thing that makes Ukraine especially easy for people to jump onto right now is a combination of things. First of all, you know, it is one of the more successfully democratic post-Soviet republics. So one of the countries that actually was in the Soviet Union that has really moved toward democracy. And the election of President Zelensky was a real indication that Ukraine was trying very hard to get to that democracy. And you know, the Ukrainian public opinion has turned very much toward Ukraine being independent. So I think all of those factors together make it an easy choice to support Ukraine. It doesn't hurt that Zelensky is this very charismatic guy. I mean, everything he's been saying has been fantastic. He's stayed in Ukraine. You know, he was offered a ride and he said, I need ammunition, not a ride. You know, he's got these sound bites. He knows what he's doing. And it's making it easy. I do think it is a double standard, though, because, you know, in terms of, for example, Palestine that you mentioned, the calculation is all about how to placate Israel as part of the global order when we don't want Palestine to be part of the global order in the same way. And so it's the balance there. It's where one half of the conflict is being treated completely differently than the other half, right. As if. And it is, I mean, that obviously, you know, has, again, its own complicated history, and it is very complicated, but the stakes that are understood in that conflict are somehow different, right? It's set up to make it so that saying I support Palestinian self-determination is harder than saying I support Ukrainian self-determination.
Right.
Why is that? I don't really know like what the root of that is, but that's how the kind of decision is set up, that some claims for self-determination are easy to support and others aren't. That doesn't seem very fair, especially given how many colonial powers had their hands in establishing the borders of the countries, including Israel, but the rest of the Middle East, right? Lots of Africa, all divided up by these colonial powers, with very little interest in actual self-determination in those cases.
Right.
So, I mean, I think in an optimistic way to look at it is that the world learned their lesson, but it's probably very, you know, generous to think that it probably has something to do, going back to, you know, people who look like most of the people in power in European democracies, right? Ukraine is a white Christian democratic country, and that makes it very easy for a lot of people, I think, to say, I see myself in that, and, you know, so we're going to support that. And clearly that hasn't been the case throughout history.
Right. And then there was also news of recently Israel building settlements, like 1,000 new settlements for Ukrainians fleeing Ukraine or the war. And so how do we reconcile with that as a society? We are displacing one group to create space for another. But yeah.
That's a great question, and such an irony, because they've also been, you know, building settlements to claim Palestinian territory. They've been doing that for some time, to you know, expand their own claims in Palestine, which, I mean, is very illegal in terms of actual, you know, international law. I would be very upset if they are using this conflict to make greater claims on land that they have been aggressively making claims on. I think that's something we should probably keep our eye on. You know, Israel is in a very strange place because they do have a lot of Russian speakers and have a kind of somewhat closer relationship with Russia than a lot of other Western European countries, and have been a little tentative in terms of their support for Ukraine, which is, it's all very interesting. And interesting in part because, Russia's whole so-called justification for this is to denazify Ukraine. And that, of course, is completely absurd language to be using in this scenario. But I don't know, it has put Israel in a very weird position in terms of whether or not it can support Ukraine. And Israel has also, they're one of the countries that prevented some of the military aid from getting to Ukraine in the past few years. So, I think it's, there's a couple levels of what's going on here, because we have these big geopolitical, Israel's thinking about its own well-being. They don't want to be the next ones invaded by Russia, because there are Russian speakers there, right. and Russia can say, well, we need to protect Russian speakers in Israel. They've used that justification before. Why wouldn't Israel be next, right? So Israel has to be careful. But, at the same time, again, we're talking about this major humanitarian crisis. So how do we balance looking at this at these two different levels that are somehow dramatically different and yet part of the exact same story? And it's very... like I said before, I think the global order is going to be shaken up by this, and countries, I hope that this doesn't become a way that other countries justify their bad practices, like Israel building settlements in Palestine. I mean, that's a bad practice. They shouldn't be allowed to do that, and they certainly shouldn't be allowed to do that in the name of Ukraine.
Right.